Most people believe they are stuck in a 9-to-5 job because of money, responsibilities, or lack of opportunity. But the truth is far more uncomfortable. The real trap isn't the job. It's a habit. A quiet, socially accepted, deeply reinforced habit that keeps intelligent, capable people looping through the same cycle year after year. And the most dangerous part? It feels responsible. It feels mature. It even feels safe. That habit is outsourcing your sense of security to something external instead of building it internally. Because once your emotional stability depends on a paycheck, once your identity depends on a job title, once your peace depends on predictability, you stop making decisions based on growth and start making them based on protection. And protection, when overused, becomes a cage. Asterisk, the 9-to-5 loop isn't just about working hours. It's a psychological structure. Wake up, commute, execute tasks, wait for the weekend, recover, repeat. It trains your nervous system to associate safety with routine and risk with danger. Over time, your brain begins to prefer predictability over possibility. You stop asking what you're capable of and start asking what's secure. You stop exploring leverage and start negotiating comfort. And that shift is subtle. It doesn't feel like surrender. It feels like adulthood. You tell yourself you're being practical. You tell yourself stability matters. You tell yourself now isn't the right time. But if you pay attention, not now slowly turns into not ever. Asterisk, this is not an attack on employment. Structure can be useful. Income is necessary. Discipline matters. The danger is not in working a job. The danger is in unconsciously allowing that job to define the ceiling of your ambition. Because when your lifestyle adjusts to your salary instead of your potential, you become dependent on maintaining the same structure that limits you. Bills expand. Commitments grow. Comfort increases. And suddenly, leaving feels irresponsible. But what actually happened is more strategic than you realize. You adapted your life around a fixed system, and the more you adapt to it, the harder it becomes to question it. Asterisk, there's a psychological principle at play here. Learned helplessness. When people operate within systems where outcomes feel predetermined, they gradually stop attempting to change them. In a corporate environment, effort does not always equal reward. Promotions are political. Raises are incremental. Recognition is inconsistent. So instead of maximizing creativity, most people minimize risk. They do enough to remain secure. Enough to avoid criticism. Enough to stay employed. And slowly, their tolerance for uncertainty shrinks. Entrepreneurship feels reckless. Skill acquisition feels optional. Strategic risk feels unnecessary. Because the system rewards compliance more than courage. And over time, compliance becomes habit. Asterisk, but the deeper layer is identity. When someone asks what you do, and you answer with your job title, that's not just information, that's self-definite. The longer you repeat that answer, the more it becomes who you believe you are. I'm an accountant, I'm a manager, I'm in operations, and there's nothing inherently wrong with those roles. The issue is when you cannot separate who you are from what you do between certain hours. Because when identity fuses with occupation, any threat to the job feels like a threat to the self. And now you're not just protecting income, you're protecting ego. That's when growth stalls. Because reinvention feels like ego death. Asterisk, society reinforces this pattern early. You are taught to seek stability before you are taught to seek leverage. Go to school, get good grades. Find a stable job, stay consistent, be realistic. Rarely are you taught to build assets before liabilities. Rarely are you taught to cultivate options. Rarely are you taught that security built on one income source is not security, it's concentration risk. But because the majority follows the same script, deviation feels dangerous. When everyone around you normalizes the loop, escaping it looks arrogant or naive. So you adjust your ambitions downward to match your environment upward. Asterisk. And then there's comfort, the most underestimated force in human behavior. Comfort is seductive because it doesn't announce itself as a limitation. It whispers. It says, this is enough. It says, you're tired. It says, you can start next year. After a long day of work, your cognitive bandwidth is reduced. Decision fatigue sets in. The idea of building something on the side feels exhausting, so you consume instead of create. Scroll instead of study. Watch instead of build. And you justify it because you worked all day, which is fair. But repetition of that cycle slowly erodes initiative. Months pass, then years, and the version of you that once wanted more becomes quieter. Asterisk, the habit keeping you stuck is not laziness. It's emotional outsourcing. It's allowing a system to dictate your financial temperature, your time freedom, your daily rhythm, and eventually your ambition. When discomfort appears, a difficult boss, limited growth, office politics, you don't immediately strategize escape. You endure, because endurance feels noble. But endurance without direction becomes stagnation. And stagnation disguised as stability is one of the most dangerous psychological traps of modern life. Asterisk. Notice how the loop conditions your perception of risk. Driving to the same office for decades feels normal. Starting a side project feels risky. Asking for a raise feels stressful. Building independent income feels unrealistic. But statistically, Depending on a single employer for survival is more fragile than building diversified skills and assets. Yet the brain doesn't calculate statistics, it calculates familiarity, and familiarity always feels safer than uncertainty. Even when it's objectively fragile. The tragedy isn't that people work 9-to-5 jobs. The tragedy is that many never build an exit option while doing so. They don't develop monetizable skills beyond their role. They don't cultivate networks outside their company. They don't experiment with leverage. They trade time for money exclusively, and time is finite. So income becomes capped by hours. And when hours are exhausted, growth plateaus. But because the paycheck arrives consistently, the urgency to innovate never becomes intense enough. Comfort dilutes ambition. And here's the most uncomfortable question. If your paycheck disappeared tomorrow, how adaptable would you be? Not emotionally, practically. Could you generate income independently? Could you sell a skill? Could you build something from zero? Or would panic replace clarity? The answer to that question reveals whether you've built security or dependency. Because true security is not a salary. It is capability. It is adaptability. It is leverage. And those are rarely developed accidentally inside rigid systems. This is how the loop sustains itself. You wake up slightly tired. You perform adequately. You earn predictably. You spend proportionally. You rest temporarily. And you repeat. There is no dramatic collapse. No visible chains. Just gradual narrowing of options. And the longer you stay, the more leaving feels like self-sabotage rather than That psychological inversion is the real prison. When freedom feels reckless and confinement feels mature, the conditioning is complete. But here's the tension we're building toward. The job is not the enemy. The habit is. The habit of choosing comfort over calculated risk. The habit of postponing skill acquisition. The habit of identifying with stability instead of capability. The habit of waiting for perfect timing. And unless that habit is interrupted consciously, the loop continues silently, not because you lack intelligence, but because you adapted too well to a system that rewards predictability more than potential. And once you see that pattern clearly, the question is no longer whether the 9-to-5 is good or bad. The question becomes far more personal. Are you using the system strategically, or is the system using your need for security to keep you exactly where you are? Once you recognize that the real trap isn't the job, but the habit of psychological dependency, a deeper layer begins to reveal itself. Fear disguised as logic. Because the 9-to-5 loop doesn't survive on force. It survives on reasonable arguments. I have responsibilities. The economy is unstable. Now isn't the right time. And on the surface, those statements are valid. But beneath them often sits something more primitive. Fear of uncertainty. Fear of judgment. Fear of failing publicly after declaring privately that you want more. The mind is incredibly skilled at turning fear into rational strategy. It doesn't say, I'm afraid to try. It says, I'm being smart. And the more intelligent you are, the better you become at justifying an action. There's a psychological comfort in knowing exactly what tomorrow looks like. Predictable income. Predictable schedule. Predictable expectations. That predictability reduces anxiety in the short term, but it also reduces adaptability in the long term. Because adaptability is built through exposure to uncertainty, not avoidance of it. When every week looks the same, your nervous system never learns how to metabolize risk properly. So even small entrepreneurial attempts feel overwhelming. Sending a proposal feels intimidating. Posting your ideas publicly feels vulnerable. Charging for your skills feels uncomfortable. Not because you're incapable, but because you're and lack of exposure gets misinterpreted as lack of ability. This is how stagnation becomes self-reinforcing. You avoid risk because you feel unprepared. You feel unprepared because you avoid risk. Meanwhile, years pass, inside the illusion of productivity, you're busy. You're tired. You're contributing, but busyness and progress are not the same thing. Many people are efficiently maintaining a life they secretly resent. They optimize performance within a system they never consciously chose. They become excellent at executing someone else's vision while postponing their own. And the longer that continues, the more difficult it becomes to confront the uncomfortable truth. You may have outgrown the structure you're still defending. There's also social reinforcement. When everyone around you follows the same rhythm, deviation feels threatening. If your friends complain about their jobs but never leave, ambition starts to sound unrealistic. If your family values stability above all else, risk begins to look selfish. So you shrink your vision to maintain belonging. Because humans fear social exile more than financial struggle. Historically, being excluded from the tribe meant death. That wiring still exists. So subconsciously, you choose conformity over expansion. You choose acceptance over ambition. And you call it practicality, But here's the paradox. The very system that feels safe is often the most fragile. Companies restructure. Industries automate. Markets shift. Entire roles disappear within a decade. And when identity and income are fused to one structure, disruption feels catastrophic. Not because you lack intelligence, but because you outsourced resilience. You trusted permanence in a world defined by change. Real security doesn't come from staying in one lane forever. It comes from building transferable value, skills that travel, reputation that extends beyond one employer, networks that exist outside one building, income streams that don't collapse simultaneously. Asterisk, yet building those requires energy after hours. And this is where the dangerous habit tightens its grip. Exhaustion becomes an excuse for postponement. After giving your best cognitive hours to your employer, you have little left for yourself. So the dream becomes something you'll pursue when things calm down. But things rarely calm down. Responsibilities increase, fatigue compounds, and the side project that once felt exciting begins to feel unrealistic. Not because it is, but because your energy has been allocated elsewhere consistently. Asterisk. Another subtle psychological trap is incremental comfort upgrades. A raise leads to a better apartment. A promotion leads to a car payment. Lifestyle expands to match income. And suddenly, your financial commitments require the very job you feel confined by. This is not accidental. It's a loop of consumption reinforcing dependency. The more your fixed expenses rise, the less freedom you feel to experiment. And experimentation is the birthplace of leverage. Without it, you remain inside linear income structures. Time equals money. Stop working, stop earning. That model caps freedom permanently. Asterisk, the habit, keeping you stuck, also feeds on comparison. You look at those who attempted something independent and failed, and your brain highlights their loss, not their courage. You see the one startup that collapsed, not the 10 skills that founder gained. Failure inside employment feels survivable. You update a resume. Failure outside feels personal. You question your competence, so you stay where failure feels less exposed. But exposure is precisely what builds psychological strength. Shielded environments create fragile confidence. Tested environments create durable self-trust. Asterisk. And then there's the illusion of later. Later I'll start the course. Later I'll build the brand. Later I'll test the idea. But later is the most seductive lie comfort tells, because later assumes future energy, future clarity, future courage. In reality, those are built through action, not waiting. Every year you delay deliberate skill building, the market evolves. Every year you delay experimenting with leverage, competition increases. Time does not pause while you prepare emotionally. It compounds for those who act and for those who hesitate. Asterisk, but this conversation isn't about reckless quitting. It's about conscious positioning. There is a massive difference between impulsively abandoning stability and strategically building options. One is reaction. The other is design. The problem is that many people do neither. They don't quit and they don't build. They remain suspended in dissatisfaction, telling themselves that awareness alone is progress. But awareness without execution becomes intellectual entertainment. You understand the trap. You analyze the trap. You discuss the trap, yet you remain inside it. Asterisk, the dangerous habit is not employment. It's passivity within employment. It's allowing your primary focus to be maintenance instead of expansion. It's measuring success only by promotions instead of capability. It's believing that loyalty guarantees security in systems designed to optimize profit, not protect potential. And when layoffs happen, those who relied solely on structure feel betrayed. But the warning signs were always there. Dependence without diversification. Asterisk. So the real question emerging now is uncomfortable but necessary. If your current path continued unchanged for the next 10 years, would you feel proud or trapped? If nothing dramatic shifted, if your income increased slightly but your autonomy remained limited, would that satisfy you? Or are you tolerating mediocrity because it feels manageable? These are not questions to provoke guilt. They are questions to provoke clarity. Asterisk, because the loop only breaks when responsibility shifts inward, not in blame, but in ownership. You may not control the economic system. You may not control corporate politics. But you control whether you build leverage alongside structure. You control whether you allocate even small amounts of time toward independent capability. You control whether you consume passively every evening or create deliberately, even imperfectly. Asterisk, the most dangerous habit is waiting for confidence before acting. Confidence is the result of repeated exposure to uncertainty, not its prerequisite. If you wait to feel ready, you will remain inside the familiar indefinitely. And familiarity, while comforting, quietly narrows your future. Asterisk, now we move deeper, because understanding the psychology is one thing, interrupting the habit is another, and the next layer isn't about fear or comfort, it's about identity reconstruction. If you are not your job, then who are you becoming outside of it? That question is where the loop either tightens or begins to crack. If you are not your job, then the real work begins with rebuilding identity from the inside out. Because the 9-to-5 loop is not just a financial structure, it is an identity container. It tells you who you are Monday through Friday. It defines your competence, your contribution, your measurable output. And when that container is stable, stepping outside of it feels disorienting. Without the title, without the hierarchy, without the familiar environment, Who are you? Most people never seriously explore that question, which is why they unconsciously cling to the structure even when it limits them. The job becomes more than income. It becomes orientation. This is where the dangerous habit evolves into something deeper. Self-limiting narratives. I'm not entrepreneurial. I'm not creative. I'm not the type to take risks. But notice how those statements are often conclusions drawn from lack of exposure, not lack of ability. If you've never consistently built something outside structured employment, of course you won't feel skilled at it. Competence is built through repetition. Yet instead of saying, I haven't practiced that yet, many people say, that's not me. And the moment you define yourself by what you haven't developed, growth contracts. Identity is powerful because behavior aligns with it automatically. If you see yourself as an employee first, you will prioritize performance within employment. If you see yourself as a builder, a learner, an adaptable strategist, your daily decisions shift. You begin asking different questions. Instead of how do I secure my position, you ask, how do I increase my leverage? Instead of how do I avoid mistakes, you ask, what can I experiment with this month? The structure outside may remain the same temporarily, but the internal orientation changes, and that internal change precedes external shifts. Another uncomfortable truth surfaces here. Many people fear success outside the system more than failure within it. Failure inside a company is shared. Targets are missed collectively. Market downturns are externalized. But success outside is personal. If you build something independently and it grows, the responsibility increases. The visibility increases. Expectations increase. And with growth comes accountability. Some individuals unconsciously avoid this expansion because mediocrity feels lighter than ownership. Inside a structured role, your ceiling is predefined. Outside it, your ceiling becomes your discipline. This is why distraction becomes a coping mechanism. Endless scrolling, streaming, passive consumption, not because you lack ambition, but because silence forces confrontation. When you sit alone without noise, you start hearing the internal tension, the quiet voice asking whether you're capable of more. That voice is uncomfortable because it demands effort. So instead of engaging with it, many people drown it in stimulation. They remain busy, but not advancing. Entertained, but not evolving. And the loop continues. Not due to oppression, but avoidance. The modern system also monetizes your complacency. Convenience is everywhere. Food delivered. Entertainment infinite. Credit easily accessible. You can live a reasonably comfortable life without ever stretching your potential significantly. That accessibility lowers the urgency to build beyond your salary. Survival no longer demands innovation for most. But comfort without intentional growth leads to subtle dissatisfaction. A feeling that something is underdeveloped. A sense that your capability exceeds your current expression. And if that tension goes unaddressed, it turns into quiet resentment. Toward work, toward the system, sometimes toward yourself. Breaking the loop requires strategic discomfort, not chaos, not recklessness. Strategic discomfort. Choosing to allocate an hour at night to skill building instead of entertainment. Choosing to learn sales, communication, coding, design, writing, investing, something that compounds independently of your employer. Choosing to test ideas before you feel fully prepared. These actions seem small, but they interrupt the habit of passive dependency. They rebuild because every time you execute outside the system, you prove to yourself that you are more than your job description. And here's the shift most people miss. You don't escape the 9-to-5 mentally by quitting. You escape it by reducing psychological reliance on it. The goal is not immediate resignation. The goal is option. When you know you could leave if necessary, not emotionally, but practically, your posture changes. You negotiate differently. You think differently. You carry yourself differently. Because dependence creates subtle fear, and fear affects decision-making. Optionality creates calm leverage. Think about it this way. If your income comes from one source, your negotiating power is minimal. If it comes from multiple skills or streams, your power increases. That power is not about arrogance. It's about stability through diversification. And diversification is a habit built gradually. Most people delay it because the current arrangement feels good enough. But good enough rarely produces freedom. It produces maintenance. There's also the myth of the big leap. Social media glorifies dramatic exits, quitting publicly, burning bridges, announcing new ventures. But sustainable transformation is usually quieter. It's months or years of invisible preparation. It's skill accumulation, network building, savings, discipline, small calculated experiments. By the time the leap happens, it's not a leap, it's a transition. The danger lies in romanticizing the jump while ignoring the groundwork. And because groundwork is slow, many abandon it prematurely. At this stage, the loop begins to look less like a prison and more like a mirror. It reflects your habits. If you spend 5 years inside employment without expanding your capability, that's not just systemic pressure, that's personal choice repeated. That realization can sting, but it's empowering. Because if habit created the stagnation, habit can reverse it. Small, consistent actions compound in both directions. Asterisk, the real transformation begins when you detach your confidence from your paycheck. When you know your value is portable. When you view employment as one channel, not the foundation of your identity. That shift doesn't make you reckless. It makes you strategic. You stop clinging and start positioning. You stop waiting and start building. You stop defining yourself by stability and start defining yourself by adaptability. Asterisk, and once that internal shift solidifies, something interesting happens. The 9-to-5 no longer feels like a trap. It becomes a tool. A temporary structure funding your leverage, a platform for skill refinement, a network access point. The difference is subtle but profound. Instead of asking, how do I survive here long term? You ask, how do I use this phase to increase my autonomy? That question alone fractures the loop. Asterisk, but we haven't reached the deepest layer yet. Because even with identity reconstructed and habits shifting, one final barrier remains. The fear of outgrowing the life you've built. And that fear is where most people hesitate, even when they're fully capable of more. The fear of outgrowing your current life is quieter than the fear of failure, but it is often stronger. Because failure threatens your ego. Outgrowing your environment threatens your belonging. When you begin thinking differently, building differently, allocating time differently, the shift does not happen in isolation. Your routines change. Your conversations change. Your priorities change. And sometimes, the people around you stay the same. That creates friction. Not necessarily conflict, but distance. And distance triggers uncertainty. If your growth disrupts familiar dynamics, your nervous system interprets that as risk. So instead of accelerating expansion, many people unconsciously slow themselves down to maintain relational equilibrium. Asterisk. This is one of the most underestimated forces keeping people in the 9-to-5 loop. Loyalty to familiarity. If your friends bond over complaining about work, what happens when you stop complaining and start strategizing exit options? If your family equates stability with virtue, what happens when you begin prioritizing leverage over predictability? Growth changes social positioning, and not everyone welcomes that change. Some will project out. Some will subtly question your realism, not because they want you to fail, but because your ambition highlights their stagnation, and that reflection can make people uncomfortable. Asterisk, so you soften your goals. You downplay your vision. You say, I'm just exploring. You shrink your timeline, because staying relatable feels safer than being misunderstood. But this is where the dangerous habit becomes self-betrayal. You begin negotiating with your own potential to preserve external comfort, and the longer you do that, the more resentment builds internally. Not toward others, toward yourself. Because deep down, you know you diluted your ambition to maintain approval. Asterisk. There's also the identity cost of success. If you've always been the responsible one, the stable one, the practical one, stepping into uncertainty challenges that image. People may question you. They may say you're changing, and they'll be right. You are. But growth requires the willingness to let outdated versions of yourself expire. Many individuals remain in the 9-to-5 loop, not because they lack opportunity, but because they're attached to being perceived a certain way. They would rather remain consistent than become expanded. Asterisk. And here's the psychological paradox. The system feels safest when everyone around you is participating in it. Collective normalization reduces individual doubt, but normalization does not equal optimization. Just because a path is common does not mean it is aligned with your capability. History is filled with individuals who were told to be realistic until the results made realism look small. The difference wasn't talent alone. It was tolerance for temporary isolation. Asterisk, breaking the loop requires emotional independence. The ability to hold a vision that others don't immediately validate. The discipline to build quietly without applause. The resilience to tolerate slower social alignment while your trajectory shifts. And this is where most attempts collapse. Not at the level of skill. At the level of identity, stability, when feedback isn't immediate, when results are delayed, when doubt creeps in during late nights, that's when comfort calls you back. It says, you had stability. Why are you complicating your life? And unless your internal standards are stronger than your external validation needs, you return. Asterisk, another barrier emerges here. The illusion of sunk cost. I've already invested years in this career. I studied for this. I worked hard to get here. And that's true. But time invested does not obligate. Time continued. If a path no longer aligns with your growth, remaining purely because of past investment compounds misalignment. The rational mind knows this. But the emotional mind resists admitting that effort may need redirection. It feels like admitting a mistake. In reality, it's admitting evolution. Asterisk, the deeper question becomes, are you building a life optimized for comfort or capability? Comfort prioritizes predictability, minimize stress, controlled outcomes. Capability prioritizes skill expansion, adaptability, diversified leverage. Comfort stabilizes quickly, but plateaus. Capability feels unstable initially, but compounds. Most people choose comfort early because the discomfort of growth feels unnecessary when survival is covered, but long-term fulfillment rarely comes from maintenance alone. Asterisk. There's also the misconception that freedom requires immediate escape. It doesn't. It requires progressive autonomy. Autonomy of thought, autonomy of income, autonomy of time, allocation, and autonomy grows in layers. First, you control how you think about your job as tool, not identity. Then you control how you use your hours outside of it. Then you control how many income streams exist. Then you control how dependent you are emotionally on structure. By the time physical departure happens, if it happens, it's almost anticlimactic, because internally, you left long before externally resigning. But this process demands patience. And patience is difficult in a culture obsessed with instant transformation. You might work a 9-to-5 for years while building something parallel. That doesn't mean you're trapped. It means you're strategic. The trap only exists when you stop building, when you stop experimenting, when you stop expanding your capacity, because stagnation is not defined by employment. It's defined by absence of growth. So the real shift is subtle but powerful. Instead of asking, how do I escape this job? You begin asking, how do I become too valuable and too adaptable to ever feel trapped again? That question redirects focus from environment to self. And when focus returns to self, agency returns with it. You stop blaming structure and start leveraging it. You stop resenting routine and start extracting skill from it. You stop fantasizing about freedom and start engineering it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The 9-to-5 loop only becomes permanent when you unconsciously choose it repeatedly. Every year you can either increase dependency or increase options. Every month you can either consume more than you create or create more than you consume. Every week you can either reinforce identity as employee only or expand identity as builder, learner, strategist. The system does not lock you in. Habits do. By this point, the illusion has weakened. You see that comfort was never neutral. It was directional. It nudged you toward maintenance. And maintenance, while safe, rarely produces expansion. The final step is not dramatic. It is decisive, a commitment to never again allow structure to replace strategy, to never again confuse stability with security, to never again let fear of social friction shrink your ambition. Because once you decide that your life will be built, deliberately not inherited passively, the loop loses its power. And in the final part, we confront the ultimate question, if not now, then when? And if not you, then who is responsible for changing the trajectory of your life? If not now, then when? That question is uncomfortable because it removes the illusion of endless time. Most people live as if clarity will arrive before action, as if one day they will wake up feeling fully ready, fully confident, fully certain. But readiness is rarely a feeling. It's a decision followed by disciplined behavior. And the longer you delay that decision, the more the loop strengthens. Not dramatically, quietly through routine, through repetition, through subtle acceptance of this is just how life is. The most dangerous moment in the 9-to-5 cycle is not the first year. It's the year when dissatisfaction becomes normal, when the tension you once felt fades into background noise, when you stop questioning and start coping. Because coping is comfortable, and comfort, unmanaged, becomes permanent. At this point, the issue is no longer employment. It's trajectory. If your current path continues unchanged for the next decade, what does that look like? Slightly higher salary, slightly higher expenses, slightly more responsibility, slightly less energy. That projection isn't catastrophic. It's incremental, and incremental stagnation is harder to confront than dramatic failure. Failure forces reassessment. Gradual comfort sedates it. You don't feel trapped enough to leave. You don't feel inspired enough to build. You exist in the middle, functioning, surviving, maintaining. But survival is not the same as expansion. The dangerous habit that keeps you stuck is not working a job. It's allowing that job to consume the best of your focus, while your long-term leverage receives the leftovers. It's treating your dreams like hobbies and your obligations like destiny. It's convincing yourself that stability today justifies limitation tomorrow. And the truth is, no one is coming to interrupt that pattern for you. There's no external event guaranteed to force growth. Layoffs might, economic shifts might, personal crises might, but waiting for disruption to trigger action is reactive living. Strategic living means you create your own inflection points. Here is the shift that changes everything. Stop asking how to escape the 9-to-5. Start asking how to outgrow dependence on it. That mindset removes desperation and replaces it with design. You don't need to quit tomorrow. You need to start building today. One skill, one project, one investment, one uncomfortable conversation, 1 hour reclaimed from passive consumption. The loop weakens every time you act in alignment with expansion instead of comfort. And understand this clearly. Freedom is not built in dramatic exits. It's built in disciplined evenings, in weekends used intentionally, in money managed strategically instead of emotionally, in saying no to lifestyle inflation when income rises, in choosing to learn when entertainment is easier. These are not glamorous decisions. No one applauds them in real time. But 5 years of those decisions create a different life. 10 years of those decisions create a different identity. Because ultimately, this is about identity. Are you someone who waits for conditions to feel safe before moving? Or are you someone who increases their capability so conditions matter less? The first mindset produces dependence. The second produces autonomy. And autonomy is not about working less. It's about choosing how you work. It's about deciding what you build. It's about knowing that if one structure collapses, you remain standing because your value is internal, not assigned. Asterisk, you do not break the loop by resenting it. You break it by outgrowing it, by becoming too skilled, too adaptable, too diversified, to ever feel psychologically cornered again. When your income has multiple channels, your confidence shifts. When your skills are portable, your posture changes. When your identity is builder first and employee second, the power dynamic reverses. You are no longer hoping to be retained. You are choosing to participate. Asterisk, and here's the final uncomfortable truth. The system will not challenge you to expand beyond what it requires. It rewards reliability, not reinvention. If you want reinvention, you must demand it from yourself. No manager will insist that you build independent assets. No corporation will prioritize your long-term autonomy over its short-term efficiency. That responsibility is yours. Entirely. Asterisk. So ask yourself honestly, are you building a life designed for comfort, or one engineered for freedom? Are you investing your prime years into maintaining predictability, or into increasing options? If your answer unsettles you, that's not a reason to retreat. It's a signal. Discomfort is data. It means there is a gap between your current trajectory and your potential, asterisk, and the moment. You accept that gap as your responsibility, not your burden. Everything shifts. You stop blaming structure. You stop romanticizing escape. You start executing, quietly, consistently, relentlessly. You turn evenings into leverage. You turn income into assets. You turn routine into training. And one day, almost unexpectedly, you realize you are no longer stuck. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Asterisk. The 9-to-5 loop only controls those who never build beyond it. It only traps those who trade long-term leverage for short-term comfort repeatedly. Break that habit, and the structure becomes optional. Maintain that habit, and even opportunity will feel threatening. Asterisk. So the real question isn't whether a 9-to-5 is good or bad. The real question is this. Are you using it as a stepping stone, or is it quietly becoming your ceiling? Asterisk. If this message challenged you, if it made you uncomfortable in a productive way, don't ignore that. That tension is where growth begins. Drop a comment and tell me what part hit the hardest. Was it comfort, identity, fear, or habit? Share this with someone who keeps saying one day, but hasn't started building yet. And if you're serious about developing leverage, psychological discipline, and a mindset that refuses passive living, subscribe and stay connected, because the next conversation might be the one that pushes you from awareness into action.